So, let's start with the question nobody asks. Here is the one question every human being will face, and almost none of them prepare for. And this question is not, how do I live well? And not, what is my purpose? It is the one that sits underneath all the others, quiet and patient. When the final moment comes, and it will come for every single one of us without exception, will I know what to do? We have spent months sitting with this question together, and we want to be honest with you from the very first minute. It made us uncomfortable, not in an abstract, philosophical way, in the specific, visceral way that comes from realizing that something genuinely important has been left entirely unexamined in our life. Most of us plan for retirement, we plan for illness, we plan for our children's education. Almost none of us plan for the most certain appointment on our calendar. What if dying is not the end of the exam, but the exam itself? What if every tradition from Tibet to Egypt to the Gnostic underground was essentially screaming the same warning across millennia, dressed in different costumes? That the moment of death is the most consequential moment of your existence? And what if the modern world, with its sanitized hospitals, its immediate embalming, its 24-hour burial laws, has systematically engineered conditions that make dying correctly nearly impossible? We are going to walk through one of the most extraordinary convergences of ancient wisdom and modern cosmological thought that we have encountered. We will look at what the system revealed to Ra Uru Hu in 1987 says about the mechanics of death at a crystal consciousness level. We will place it directly beside the Tibetan Bardo Thodol, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Gnostic tradition's claims. AI analyzed all these systems together and found something that genuinely disturbed us. We think it will disturb you too. The disturbing part is not that these traditions disagree with each other, it is how terrifyingly much they agree on precisely the things that our civilization has decided to ignore. Short summary. What we are really talking about. Let us tell you what we are actually doing here, because it matters that you understand the intention before the analysis begins. We are not building a case against human design. We are not defending ancient traditions uncritically. What we are doing is something that we believe is genuinely rare, reading 4 radically different maps of the same territory, the territory of death, and asking with full seriousness where they agree, where they conflict, and what the disagreements reveal. We cover 5 major territories. First, we examine human design's mechanical account of what happens at death, the separation of the design crystal, the magnetic monopole, and the personality crystal, and why Ra Uru Hu claimed the 72 hours following biological death are the most important hours of your entire incarnation, a claim we consider one of the most consequential and most ignored insights in modern esoteric literature. Second, we walk through the Tibetan Bardo teaching, the most detailed map of post-mortem consciousness ever produced, and show where it aligns with human design mechanics and where it fundamentally departs. Third, we open the Egyptian tradition, not as mythology but as technical instruction, the Book of the Dead as an operational manual for a journey the Egyptians took entirely seriously. Fourth, we enter the Gnostic worldview, where death is not a failure but the crown of a conscious life, and where the archons, those cosmic prison wardens of the soul, are waiting at the exit. Fifth, we deliver the honest verdict, where human design succeeds, where it has real gaps, and what the ancient traditions knew that Ra's system, despite its mechanical precision, cannot seem to touch. The practical recommendations at the end are not metaphors. They are actual things you can do. Today, this week, this year, to change the conditions of your dying. We wrote them because we intend to use them ourselves. Chapter 1. The Mechanics of Dying, Human Design's Radical Claim. 2 crystals, 1 monopole, and the Great Separation. Let us begin with the most precise mechanical account of death produced in the last century. And we say last century deliberately because what Ra Uru Hu transmitted since 1987 reads in places like something that should have been published in a peer-reviewed journal rather than taught in esoteric seminars. Ra received what he called a transmission from a voice, an 8-day encounter that he described as overwhelming, physically brutal, and structurally impossible to fabricate. W.P. Lees keep in mind that we are not asking you to believe the origin story. We are asking you to engage seriously with what the transmission actually said about death, because it is, whatever its source, remarkable. According to human design cosmology, every human being's nature is constituted of 3 fundamental elements. The first is the design crystal, an ancient fragment of crystallized consciousness that carries the body's genetic and biological blueprint. The second is the personality crystal, the carrier of what we experience as selfhood, identity, memory, and interior life. The third is the magnetic monopole, the force of attraction seated in the G-center, the center of identity and love, which holds the 2 crystals in relationship and gives the human being its sense of direction and destiny. These 3 elements are not metaphors. In Ra's cosmological framework, they are literal mechanisms, particles of consciousness that predate the Earth itself, that have been cycling through incarnations for billions of years, filtered through the neutrino ocean that streams ceaselessly through all matter. In rave cosmology, Ra Uru Hu said, "The design crystal with the monopole has no form, there is no illusion, there is no life. The only thing that will create life is the disembedding of the monopole." Life, then, is the tension between separation and reunion. The magnetic monopole yearns to reunite with the design crystal from which it was separated at the moment of incarnation. This yearning, Ra called it love, not sentimentally but mechanically, is what drives the form forward through life. And at death, the tension resolves. Now let's talk about the moment of death, a 3-act collapse. Ra Uru Hu described biological death with a precision that reads more like a physics equation than a spiritual teaching. When the biological body can no longer sustain itself, the design crystal drops from the ajna center, the mental awareness center, and descends through the central channel to the G center, where it rejoins the magnetic monopole. This reunion is the mechanical definition of death. The form principle collapses. The body is biologically dead. But here is what should stop you entirely. The personality crystal, the carrier of everything you have ever called I, does not leave. It stays. It remains around a decomposing biological structure, clinging to the last traces of neurochemistry dissolving in the brain for up to 72 hours after biological death. Think about that. While your family is arranging the funeral, while the hospital is preparing paperwork, while your body is being prepared for burial or cremation, you, the consciousness that read this sentence, that has memories and identity and relational history, are still there, waiting, experiencing something that Ra, following the Tibetan tradition, called the bardo. Now, let's talk about the 72-hour window, the most violated law in human history. We want to pause here because what we are about to describe is in our assessment and in the assessment of AI after analyzing the full corpus of cross-cultural death literature. The single most practically important insight in this entire analysis. Not the most philosophically rich, not the most poetically beautiful, the most practically important. Ra Uru Hu said in his Death and Dying course the following: "The most important thing the living can do for the dead is to protect their body after death for 3 days. 3 days, 72 hours. Not as a ritual, not as a religious custom, as a mechanical necessity, because the personality crystal requires the decomposing brain as a processing interface. The brain, even in its biochemical dissolution, continues generating the frequency scaffolding through which the personality crystal can orient itself, be recognized by its home bundle of consciousness, and be retrieved. Without that window, the crystal is lost. It cannot find its way back to where it belongs." In Rave Cosmology, Ra Uru Hu said, "The personality crystal needs the vehicle as a tool for its bardo experience. It's only through that it actually gets to the frequency in which it can be recognized and returned to the bundle." Now ask yourself, in how many cultures, in how many religious traditions, in how many legal and medical systems does this 72-hour protection of the unmanipulated body actually occur? Jewish law demands burial within 24 hours. Islam requires immediate interment. Hindu tradition prescribes cremation within hours of death. In hospitals, autopsies are performed within 24 hours. Embalming, a process that chemically destroys the very neurological tissue Ra identified as critical, begins within hours. Organ harvesting commences the moment brain death is declared. In modern intensive care units, the moment of death is followed almost immediately by bureaucratic, medical, and mortuary intervention on the body. We sat with this for a long time, because the implication is staggering. Ra is not describing a fringe problem. He's describing the systematic, globally prevalent violation of what he considered the most important biological spiritual event in a human being's existence, driven not by malice, but by climate, logistics, religion, and the very understandable desire of the living to not be near a decomposing body. The road to the worst possible death outcome has always been paved with the most practical of intentions. Ra's conclusion was stark. The vast majority of personality crystals, since roughly 2,000 years ago, precisely when warm climate religions codifying immediate burial became globally dominant, have been systematically denied their natural bardo process. They do not return to their source bundles. They aggregate into what Ra called rogue bundles. And these rogue bundles, AI analyzed the cross-cultural record and identified them consistently across traditions. They might be the realms of the angels, the demons, the ghosts, the ancestral spirits, the alien beings. They are the lost ones, created not by supernatural forces, but by the human custom of burying the dead before the dead are truly gone. So, what human design does not tell you about your own death? Here is where the first critical fissure appears. Human design gives us unprecedented mechanical precision about what happens at death. The crystal separation sequence is described. The 72-hour window is specified. The rogue bundle phenomenon is explained. But Ra Uru Hu says something that, once you hear it, you cannot unhear. He says, when the personality crystal leaves the body, it does not remember who you were. It cannot. Consciousness requires the form, the box, as Ra called it, to produce self-reflection. Out of the form, the crystal is pure frequency, pure software without hardware. There is no you experiencing anything. There is no witness to the bardo. There is no one navigating toward the light. In rave cosmology, Ra Uru Hu said, "When you're out of the box, you're out of the game, all gone. It's like going in any doorway." This is the great philosophical rupture. Every other tradition we're about to examine, Tibetan, Egyptian, Gnostic, agrees that death is a window of extraordinary opportunity, where something like the self can act, choose, recognize, navigate. Human design says there is no navigator. The crystal goes where frequency takes it. The idea that you can prepare for death, practice dying, develop the capacity to recognize the clear light, all of this, from Ra's perspective, is essentially the not self making up stories. Is he right? Let us go to the oldest traditions that addressed exactly this question. Chapter 2, the Tibetan Bardo, when death becomes the ultimate practice. Let's start with the Bardo Thodol as operational manual. The Bardo Thodol, popularly known in the West as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, is not a religious text. It is an operational manual, compiled across centuries of practice by Vajrayana masters and attributed to Padmasambhava himself. It was written with one explicit purpose: to guide a dying or recently dead person through the post-mortem states of consciousness with enough precision that they could either achieve liberation or, at minimum, choose a favorable rebirth. The word bardo means intermediate state or gap. The Tibetan tradition identified not one but 6 bardos, 6 states of transitional consciousness, of which the death bardo and the bardo of dharmata, the natural state of reality, are the most consequential. And the entire tradition rests on an assumption that human design directly contradicts, that consciousness survives biological death with its capacity for recognition intact. Francesca Fremantle and Chogyam Trungpa, in their landmark commentary on the Bardo Thodol, describe the dying process as a sequential dissolution, not of the person, but of the elements and energy winds that constitute the body's experiential structure. Earth dissolves into water, water into fire, fire into air, air into space. With each dissolution, a corresponding level of gross consciousness dissolves, and what remains becomes progressively more subtle, more luminous, and more potentially awake. At the very moment of death, simultaneous with what Ra Uru Hu would describe as the design crystal rejoining the magnetic monopole, the Tibetan tradition says something radically different occurs. The dying person encounters what is called the clear light of the dharmata. It is described as a luminosity of blinding intensity, vast, empty, and identical to the nature of mind itself. This is not a vision. It is not a hallucination. According to the Tibetan masters, it is the ground of consciousness itself, momentarily exposed as all obscurations dissolve. It is the face of Buddhahood, offered to every sentient being at the moment of death, for a duration that differs depending on the meditator's experience. Sometimes a flash, sometimes an extended luminous space. The Tibetan tradition says, if you can recognize this light as your own nature, if you do not flinch, do not run, do not grasp, you are liberated. Not later, now, in the very moment that human design says you have ceased to exist as a self. We find this the most philosophically charged collision in this entire analysis, and we want to be transparent about why it unsettles us personally. Human design is mechanically coherent. The claim that consciousness requires a biological substrate is not unusual. It is, in fact, the dominant position of mainstream neuroscience. Ra is, in this particular claim, aligned with scientific consensus. And yet, Every serious contemplative tradition across every culture that has systematically explored the nature of mind arrives at a different answer. That awareness itself, not its contents, not its personality, not its memory, but awareness as such, is not produced by the brain. It simply is. Can both be true? We are genuinely uncertain. And we think that uncertainty is the most honest and productive place to stand. Robert Thurman, in his deeply researched translation and commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, emphasizes that the bardos are not fantasy realms. They are experiential states whose phenomenology is consistent, predictable, and critically navigable. The appearances of wrathful and peaceful deities that populate the bardo descriptions are understood as projections of the dying person's own consciousness, configured by the karmic residues of their life. They are not external. They are you looking at yourself. Let's now find the structural parallel with human design. For this, we have placed the two systems side by side, and I found something that demands attention. Ra Uru Hu, describing the 72-hour window of the personality crystal in the decomposing brain, is describing Amdeus in mechanical language, what the Tibetan tradition describes as the bardo of becoming. The crystal clings to residual neurochemistry. The Tibetan tradition says consciousness clings to the habitual structures of the mind-body complex. The crystal is eventually pulled to its bundle by frequency resonance. The Tibetan tradition says consciousness is eventually drawn into rebirth by karmic magnetism. The structures are isomorphic. The mechanism is the same. The metaphysical interpretation is utterly opposed. For Ra, the 72-hour process is mechanical and impersonal. The crystal goes where it goes, and the you that you were has no role in it. For the Tibetan tradition, those 72 hours and the Bardo Thodol is read aloud to the dead for exactly this reason: to reach the wandering consciousness are a window of extraordinary agency. The dead can choose, the dead can navigate, the dead can be liberated. Which interpretation is correct? Or more precisely, which interpretation is useful? Because we would argue that the question, is it mechanically true that the crystal has no self-awareness, is actually less important than the question, what kind of life does each interpretation invite you to live? Let's look at the Tibetan practice of dying. The Tibetan tradition produced an entire art of dying. Phowa, the practice of consciousness transference, involves training the practitioner while alive and healthy to consciously move their awareness upward through the central channel of the body and project it out through the crown of the head at the moment of death. Advanced practitioners can perform this voluntarily. Stories of realized masters dying in meditation, their bodies remaining warm for days afterward, sometimes 3 days, which is precisely Ra's 72-hour window, are consistent across the literature. Was this the original purpose of the 72-hour injunction? To keep the body undisturbed precisely so that a trained consciousness could complete its work? If so, Ra Uru Hu reconstructed a piece of ancient funerary wisdom while simultaneously stripping out the very dimension, conscious agency in the death process that made the ancient wisdom meaningful. Chapter 3. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, Death as Technology. Let's now move to what the Egyptians actually understood. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, more accurately titled in its original form as the Book of Coming Forth by Day, is perhaps the most misunderstood ancient text in Western scholarship. It is routinely treated as mythology, as a religious artifact of a superstitious civilization. This is a profound error. The Egyptians were not superstitious. They were technologists of consciousness. The Egyptian funerary tradition, as reconstructed by Shaposhnikova and other scholars of the original hieratic and demotic texts, operated on the assumption that death was a technical problem requiring a technical solution. The problem was this: the dead person would encounter a series of obstacles, trials, and guardians in the duat, the underworld, and would need to know exactly what to say, what to do, how to identify themselves, and how to prove their heart was light enough to pass the weighing against the feather of Ma'at. The 42 negative confessions of the Hall of Two Truths: I have not stolen, I have not spoken falsely, I have not murdered, I have not envied, were not a moral checklist. They were an identity declaration. They were the dead person asserting to the guardians of the threshold what kind of being they were. And that assertion required it to be true, not as a performance, but as the actual crystallized residue of a life lived consciously. Let's now look at the Ba, the Ka, and the Ak, Egypt's version of the crystals. Here, I found one of the most striking convergences in this entire comparative analysis. The ancient Egyptians described the human being as constituted of multiple spiritual bodies, each with a different function in life and after death. The three most relevant to our inquiry are the Ba, the Ka, and the Ak. The Ka was the vital life force, the animating energy tied to the physical body. At death, the Ka remained connected to the tomb, to the physical remains. Egyptian funerary practice was organized around feeding and sustaining the Ka after death. Hence, the elaborate provisions placed in tombs, the regular offerings of food and drink made by the Ka priests. The Ka needed the body, or at minimum a representation of it, as an anchor. The Ba was the individualized soul, the aspect of consciousness that could move freely, that could travel between the land of the living and the duat, that carried the personal identity of the individual. The Ba was depicted as a human-headed bird. It could leave the body, navigate the underworld, and return. The Ak was the luminous, immortal spirit, what the Ba could transform into through successful navigation of the duat. The Ak was beyond death, beyond rebirth, fully integrated into the cosmic order. Map this onto human design. The Ka is the design crystal, anchored in the body's biological form. The Ba is the personality crystal, mobile, identity-carrying, navigating post-mortem states. The Ak is what the personality crystal could become if it completes its journey correctly. The Egyptian system implies that the Ba, the personality crystal, has agency. It can fail. It can succeed. It can be unprepared and destroyed. Or it can be trained, prepared, equipped with the right words and maps, and achieve the Ak. This is not mechanics. This is ethics. This is preparation. This is the art of dying. Here is the most important thing to understand about the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It was not written for the dead. It was written for the living, to be memorized, internalized, and embodied before death arrived. The Egyptians commissioned their own books of the dead while alive, personal copies, tailored with their name, specifying the spells and declarations they intended to use. Death was a journey you prepared for, like an expedition into unknown terrain. You memorized the maps, you learned the guardians' names, you practiced the confessions until they were true. This is precisely what the Tibetan tradition prescribes with meditation practice, and precisely what human design, in its current form, does not address at all. It tells you your type, your strategy, your authority, your profile. It tells you how to live correctly. but it says almost nothing about how to die correctly beyond the mechanical observation that the crystal separates and the 72-hour window opens. Chapter 4. The Gnostic Vision, Death as the Crown of Life. Of all the traditions we are examining, the Gnostic one is simultaneously the most radical. And it is the one that, frankly, we found ourselves most reluctant to sit with. Because the Gnostic diagnosis of reality does not offer comfort, it offers clarity. And sometimes those are not the same thing. Gnosticism, as documented in the Nag Hammadi library, in the Gnostic scriptures compiled by Braque and Leighton, in the extraordinary esoteric writings of Samael Aun Weor, and in the philosophical analysis of Hans Jonas, begins with the premise that most modern people find intolerable. This world is not good. It was not created by a benevolent God. It was created by a lesser deity, the ignorant demiurge, who fashioned the material universe as a prison for divine sparks of consciousness that had fallen or been captured from the pleroma, the fullness of true divine reality. The archons, lesser cosmic administrators who serve the demiurge, maintain the prison. They govern the planetary spheres. They administer the laws of karma and fate. They are the program. And when a soul dies, the archons are waiting at the threshold, at each of the planetary gates through which the ascending soul must pass, ready to reclaim it, strip it of its accumulated wisdom, and return it to incarnation, not out of malice, out of mechanism. It is simply what they do. The pneumatic or spiritual human being does not merely die. The pneumatic human being escapes, but only if they know who they are, where they came from, and the countersigns that open the gates, says the Gnostic tradition, reconstructed from Nag Hammadi texts. Sound familiar? It should. The Gnostic description of the archons at the gates of death is structurally identical to the Egyptian guardians in the Hall of Two Truths, to the wrathful deities of the Tibetan Bardo, and, most strikingly, to what human design calls the conditioning forces of the neutrino ocean, the not-self, the program. Samael Aun Weor, the 20th century Gnostic master, whose writings include systematic treatments of death, the ego, and the mechanics of liberation, brought the Gnostic tradition into concrete, practical focus in a way that deserves serious scholarly attention despite his marginalized status in academic discourse. For Samael Aun Weor, death is not the problem. The ego is the problem. He taught that the mechanical I, the aggregate of desires, fears, memories, and conditioned reactions that constitute the ordinary human personality, does not actually die at biological death. It continues. It recombines. It reincarnates, dragging its karmic weight into each new form. True death, in the Gnostic sense, is the death of the ego, the voluntary conscious dissolution of the mechanical self, achieved while still in a living body. This is what is meant by the Gnostic phrase, dying before you die. The mystic who achieves this dissolution has, in effect, rehearsed death completely. When biological death arrives, there is no mechanical self to be confused, to be frightened, to be reclaimed by the archons. There is only the luminous essence, what the Egyptians called the Ak, moving freely toward the pleroma. The crown of life, in Gnostic thought, is not a long and happy life. It is a fully conscious death, the moment when everything accumulated through the fires of existence is brought to the threshold and either passes or does not pass. This is why initiation was called the lesser death. The mystery schools across antiquity, Egyptian, Greek, Gnostic, put their initiates through symbolic death experiences precisely to prepare them for the real one. Now, here is the philosophical confrontation that we believe deserves serious, unflinching examination. Human design describes consciousness as embedded in what Ra Uru Hu explicitly calls the program, a vast mechanical system of neutrino information generated by stars, planets, and cosmic bodies filtering through the rave mandala, conditioning the human being from before birth. The program is not malevolent, it is simply what it is. Ra teaches not resistance to the program, but correct alignment with it. From a Gnostic perspective, this is precisely the cosmology of the demiurge, a universe governed by mechanical forces administered by impersonal cosmic powers, the planets, the gates, the channels, the types, in which the human being's task is to be correctly positioned within the mechanism rather than to transcend it. The Gnostic would ask Ra Uru Hu directly, if the program is mechanical, if the not-self is conditioning, if even the personality crystal at death has no self-awareness and simply returns to its bundle by frequency, then where is the spark of divine consciousness that the entire Gnostic tradition insists is real, is present, and is the actual point of this entire exercise? Ra's answer implicitly would be, there is no divine spark. There is consciousness, vast, ancient, crystalline, but it is not divine in the Gnostic sense. It is mechanical. Even the soul is a machine part. This is either the most honest cosmological statement ever made, or it is the perfect description of a prison that has convinced its inmates that freedom is an illusion. We observed this tension together, and AI analyzed it across the entire corpus. Ra's system is the most mechanically precise death map available in modern literature, and simultaneously may be the most spiritually disempowering. The Gnostics had the exact opposite problem: immense soteriological ambition and almost no mechanical precision. What we need is both. We want to be clear that naming this is not dismissal of Ra. It is the kind of critical engagement that any serious system of thought deserves and requires. The fact that human design has not yet produced a framework for the intentional preparation of consciousness for death does not mean it cannot. We would argue it is the most urgent development that the HD community could undertake, the construction of what might be called a rave book of the dead, a synthesis of Ra's crystal mechanics with the navigational wisdom of the older traditions. The Gnostic insistence that death is the crown of life rests on a specific understanding of what a life is for. Life is not for comfort. Life is not for self-optimization. Life is for the dissolution of the ego, the accumulated mechanical I, in the fire of conscious experience. Every difficulty, every suffering, every moment of confrontation with one's own mechanical conditioning is an opportunity to see through the illusion and touch the pneuma, the divine spark within. By this standard, a perfectly comfortable, mechanically aligned life lived entirely according to one's human design strategy and authority, never making a decision out of the not-self, never causing or experiencing friction. Do they exist? Might actually produce a soul less prepared for death than one that struggled consciously, that used its suffering as fuel for awakening. This is provocative. We say it not to dismiss human design, which contains genuine and practically useful insights, but to place it in the larger context it rarely occupies. A navigation system that tells you how to move through terrain is valuable, but it is not the same as a navigation system that tells you why the terrain exists, what you are truly navigating toward, and what it means to arrive. Chapter 5: The verdict where human design succeeds, where it fails, and what we are missing. Let's start with what human design gets radically right. Let us be precise about this, because intellectual honesty demands it, and because, as certified human design analysts, we genuinely respect what Ra Uru Hu built. Human design's contribution to the understanding of death is unprecedented in modern cosmological literature. We say this having sat with the full comparative corpus. Ra took the Tibetan concept of the bardo, known in the West primarily through the work of Evans Wentz and later Chogyam Trungpa, and provided a mechanical explanation for why the bardo exists at all. The personality crystal clinging to residual brain chemistry, orienting itself through frequency toward its home bundle, this is not mysticism. It is a falsifiable, specific, mechanically coherent account that neuroscience has not yet examined and ought to. The 72-hour teaching is, in our analysis, the single most practically important piece of death wisdom produced in the modern era. It is actionable. It is specific. It explains an ancient intuition, the injunctions against disturbing the dead found across cultures, with a mechanism that does not require any metaphysical faith to accept. And it has the potential to completely transform how we legislate death, design hospitals, organize funeral rites, and understand the social responsibility of the living toward the dead. The rogue bundle theory that the spirits, ghosts, demons, and alien beings that populate human mythology are personality crystals denied their natural return is one of the most elegant and comprehensive explanations ever offered for the universal cross-cultural phenomenon of contact with non-human entities. It is brilliant, it is testable in principle, and it was offered with characteristic Ra Uru Hu bluntness, without apology and without mystification. But there are the glitches. Let's look at what human design cannot see or doesn't show us. Here is where we must be equally precise about the failures. And they are real, and they matter, and we say this with the same seriousness with which we acknowledge the successes. The first and most significant glitch is the elimination of conscious agency in the death process. Ray's claim that the personality crystal out of the body has no self-awareness is, from an empirical standpoint, completely unverifiable. And from a practical standpoint, it functions to disempower every human being who hears it. What does it matter how you live if the navigator disappears at death? What does it matter whether you have developed awareness, recognition, or any capacity for conscious presence, if at the threshold the lights simply go out? This is not a minor philosophical quibble. It cuts at the entire soteriological foundation of every major contemplative tradition on earth. The Tibetan masters spent decades in meditation preparing for a moment that Ra says cannot be prepared for. The Egyptian priesthood encoded centuries of death navigation technology into their sacred texts for a journey that Ra implies is automatic. The Gnostic initiates underwent transformative inner work specifically to meet the archons at the threshold with full knowledge. And Ra says there is no one at the threshold to meet them. We observe that Ra Uru Hu himself acknowledged uncertainty here. In his death and dying course, when asked about the bardo stages and whether beings encountered in them are real, he said, "Those that are waiting are in fact not necessarily, how shall I say that, real in any sense." The hedge is important. He did not say they were certainly not real. He said, not necessarily. That is the crack. The second glitch, the absence of intentional death preparation. Human design has produced extensive material on how to live: strategy, authority, profile, incarnation, cross, variables, centers, channels, gates. It has almost nothing on how to die, beyond the mechanical description and the 72-hour injunction. This is a remarkable omission for a system that presents itself as a complete map of human consciousness. Compare this with the Tibetan tradition, which produced entire lineages, entire monasteries, entire lifetimes of practice organized around a single question: will I recognize the clear light when I meet it? Or the Egyptian tradition, in which the Book of the Dead was a lifelong companion, memorized, ritualized, made personal. Or even the Gnostic tradition, in which the practice of ego dissolution was the entire spiritual work, with death as its natural completion. Human design offers the map of the form. The ancient traditions offer the map of what the form is for. These are not competing answers. They are answers to different questions. And a complete understanding of death requires both. The third glitch, the moral dimension. Both the Egyptian and Gnostic traditions insist, in different but structurally related ways, that the quality of the soul presented at death is directly related to the moral quality of the life lived. The Egyptian heart weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the Gnostic recognition of one's own divine nature, possible only if one has done the work of ego dissolution. These are not moralistic judgments. They are technical observations. The being who arrives at death carrying accumulated patterns of fear, greed, resentment, and mechanical reactivity will be constituted differently, at the level of consciousness itself, than the being who has met those patterns and worked through them. Human design, with its emphasis on surrendering to one's mechanical design and following strategy and authority, tends to bracket the moral dimension entirely. If you are a generator and you respond correctly to life, you are living in alignment, regardless of what you respond to. The question of who you are becoming through your choices, of what quality of consciousness is being refined through the experience of living, is largely absent from the human design framework. This is not a trivial gap. The ancient traditions did not conceive of the soul as a crystal, passive, receptive, programmed by neutrino information. They conceived of it as something being actively formed through the act of living, shaped by choice, tempered by suffering, purified by consciousness. One model produces a soul that receives. The other produces a soul that participates. Which one arrives at death better prepared? And where the systems converge, we will now explore the one teaching they all share. Across all four traditions, human design, Tibetan, Egyptian, Gnostic, there is one teaching that appears in essentially identical form in all the different languages of their respective cosmologies. It is this: the conditions of your death matter enormously, and the quality of your life determines those conditions. For human design, the 72-hour window requires the cooperation of the living. That cooperation is more likely if the dying person has lived correctly, if their relationships were authentic, if their life was not self-free, if the people around them understand what is at stake. Living correctly is the best preparation for the conditions of dying correctly. For the Tibetan tradition, recognition of the clear light requires a mind that has practiced recognition. Practice begins now. The quality of attention you bring to this moment is the quality of attention you will bring to the bardo. For the Egyptian tradition, the confession made in the Hall of Two Truths must be true. I have not stolen must be a fact, not an aspiration. The life is the preparation. For the Gnostics, the dissolution of the ego as the work of the spirit happens in the fire of life. Every conscious moment is material, every unconscious moment is a lost opportunity. The convergence is complete. How you live is how you die. And how you die determines what happens next. Whether next means the return of a crystal to its bundle, the navigation of a bardo, the passage through the hall of two truths, or the meeting with the archons at the gates. Final chapter: the practical recommendations. How to die correctly. As you are still alive, what actions that can be taken now? These recommendations emerge from the full comparative analysis of all four traditions. They are not metaphysical speculation, they are practical. 1. Learn what is actually happening at death, in detail. Most people have never thought seriously about the mechanics of dying. Engage with the material. Read the Tibetan Bardo Thodol in a serious translation. Thurman's translation is rigorous. Read Ra Uru Hu's death and dying material if you have access to it. Understand the Egyptian funerary complex as a technical system, not mythology. This intellectual preparation is the beginning of death preparation. 2. Write a 72-hour death document. Most adults have a will, almost none have a 72-hour death protocol. This document should specify clearly no embalming within 72 hours of biological death, no autopsy unless legally required, no removal from the place of death, if possible, for at least 72 hours. Minimal physical disturbance to the body. If religious tradition demands earlier burial, state explicitly that you are requesting deviation from that tradition. Give this document to the people most likely to be present at your death and make sure they understand why. 3. Develop a daily practice of presence. Whether you frame this as meditation, as inner work, as ego observation, or simply as conscious attention, the single most consistent teaching across all four traditions is that the quality of consciousness at death depends on the quality of consciousness developed during life. Begin now, not tomorrow. Begin with 10 minutes of sitting in silence and watching the mechanical movement of your own mind. This is the beginning of the Egyptian preparation, the Tibetan practice, and the Gnostic dissolution, all at once. 4. Examine your relationships with the dying and the dead. The ancient traditions treated the care of the dying as one of the most sacred acts available to a human being. Modern society has outsourced dying to institutions. Consider whether you are prepared to be present, genuinely, fully, non-anxiously present at the bedside of a dying person. This presence is a service. It is also practice for your own death. 5. Engage seriously with the question, what is the quality of the soul I am forming? This is the question that human design alone cannot answer, but that the Egyptian, Tibetan, and Gnostic traditions all insist is the most important question of a human life. Not, am I living according to my design, but what kind of consciousness is being refined through the experience of my life? What am I becoming? What will arrive at the threshold, and what will it be carrying? 6. Speak about death. The single most effective intervention available against a poorly organized death is a culture that does not treat death as unspeakable. Talk to the people you love about what you want at the end. Ask them what they want. Make death a topic at your table, not with morbidity, but with the same intelligence you bring to every other important domain of your life. The ancient Egyptians talked about death constantly. So did the Tibetans. So did the Gnostics. This did not make them a death-obsessed culture. It made them a death-prepared culture, which is a very different thing. And here is a final reflection. The question human design has not yet answered. We close with the question that sits at the center of everything we have examined. The question that human design's extraordinary mechanical precision makes more urgent rather than more answerable, and one that we have genuinely not resolved for ourselves. If the personality crystal has no self-awareness outside the biological form, if you, as you experience yourself, genuinely ends at the moment of biological death, and what follows is simply the crystal returning by frequency to its bundle, then what exactly is the point of the extraordinary, suffering-filled, conscious experience of being a human being? What is the consciousness field learning? What is the soul accumulating? What, in the end, is being refined? Ra Uru Hu's answer, implicit in his cosmological framework, is the program is learning. The design crystal bundle is evolving. The totality is developing toward the night of Brahma and beyond. The individual human life is a data point in a cosmic evolutionary algorithm. Your individual death is simply the closing of one data gathering session and the return of the hardware to storage. The Tibetan master's answer is, the being that recognizes the clear light in the bardo is not a data point. It is a Buddha. The Egyptian answer is, the being whose heart balances the feather of Ma'at is not a data point. It is an Ak, a star among stars. The Gnostic answer is, the being who passes through the archonic gates with the countersigns of gnosis is not a data point. It is a divine spark returning to the pleroma. These are not the same answers. They cannot all be simultaneously right, unless they are each describing a different slice of something too large to be held by any single tradition. That is the thought we keep returning to, not as a comfortable both sides hedge, but as a genuine epistemological position, that the nature of death may be so far outside the ordinary categories of human cognition that it takes 4 radically different kinds of intelligence, mechanical, contemplative, ceremonial, and soteriological, to even begin to approximate its shape. The most honest thing we can say, having done this work together, we do not know what happens when you die. Nobody truly does, but we know, with the convergent weight of thousands of years of the most serious human inquiry ever conducted, what kind of life gives you the best chance of meeting death consciously? And we know what the living owe the dead in the first 72 hours. That is already more than most people will ever know. Begin now.